Good morning and welcome to Live with Lewis for September 23rd, 2004. We're coming to you today from the tribal headquarters of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, located just about 10 miles north of Big Bend Dam and just across from Fort Thompson and the Crow Creek Reservation here in South Dakota. We're about an hour south of Pierre, South Dakota, and want to welcome everyone to our broadcast today. As always, we will invite you to send your email questions to lewisandclark@clayton.k12.mo.us. That's Lewis and Clark, LEWISANDCLARK, all spelled out, Lewis and Clark, at Clayton, CLAYTON.K12.mo.us. And we look forward to your email questions and comments throughout today's broadcast. As always, we will be starting our broadcast today with a historical perspective from the journals of Lewis and Clark on their experiences as they made their way up the Missouri River 200 years ago. And then we'll be talking about the experiences that we've had as part of the Discovery Expedition on our journey 200 years later as we move through the same part of this country. And then we'll be visiting today with several members, or at least one or two members from the Lower Brule tribe here in Lower Brule, where we're located today. 200 years ago, as Lewis and Clark made their way up the Missouri River, one of the most important aspects of that journey was to document the flora and fauna, the animals and plant life, as well as the mineral content of the land that they found along the way. Of course, Jefferson had instructed Lewis to be very observant about not only the plants and animals, but the geology that was encountered along the way. And Lewis, of course, had studied in Philadelphia to do just those things. And here in this part of the country is where that part of the mission was very important because, of course, European Americans were very ignorant of the life forms that actually lived here. This was a journey of exploration and education, and when they passed into this part of the country, it was very important for Lewis to record those new animal species and plant life and the geology of the land through which they were moving so that they would have a better understanding of this place. And that became very important. As we've talked about over the last several weeks, they had started to encounter plants and animals that were new to the European mind, and many of those animals have really in this area become paramount. Just the last week or so we've talked about things like the fact that they had seen the prairie dogs for the first time and that sort of thing. And here the same sort of thing is true. In the last week, Lewis and Clark encountered, as they record in the journals, coyotes, which for a long time they had referred to as fox. They thought that they were fox, and for the first time they were able to shoot one and actually collect a specimen and understand that it was a different animal altogether. Moreover, they also in this area started to encounter the mule deer, which was new to European science at that time. They had never encountered the mule deer before, and so they record that. The antelope also. Lewis had collected a specimen of the male, and just this past week he would be spending a great deal of time trying to take a female antelope, and so that he could understand the difference in the male and female of the species. Also, they encountered the American magpie, which was a subspecies of the European magpie, or what they would call Corvus americanus. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit later today about the importance of that taking of that species as a collection, as they collected that species here in this area, because they named a creek here. One of the creeks was American Creek, across just below and across from where we are now, American Creek, and the other was now known as Crow Creek, and those were named for the Corvus americanus that they collected in this area. Also, they noticed a great deal of differentiation in the ground itself and the geology of this area. Lewis had continued to search through this area for what he believed were signs of volcanic activity. He believed that there were volcanoes in this area because of some of the rocks formations that he had seen, but at this point he's starting to understand that the formations that he's seen are not volcanic in nature, but are something quite different. And indeed what he was actually seeing was the striation of the Pierre, what's called the Pierre Shale, or the glacial movements and the glacial residue that was left by glacial movements many millions of years prior, actually. So it's an exciting time from the perspective, the historical perspective of Lewis and Clark, as they start to record all this information that's completely new to the European mind. And moreover, they're also starting to enter into the land of the Sioux Nation, the Great Sioux Empire, which Jefferson had told them about and expressed how important it was that they spend time interacting with the Sioux Nation. In fact, he did not believe that they would actually meet very many tribes because he thought that because of the hunting time that they would maybe be away from the river, and indeed they were. But again, he impressed upon Lewis the need for them to go out of their way to develop strong relations with the Sioux Nation. And one of the things that's important to realize that while this trip began for Meriwether Lewis in July of 1803, it wasn't until January, and a letter actually dated January 22nd of 1804, after the purchase of Louisiana, or the agreement that the United States had made with France at that time to get France to relinquish its claims to Louisiana, that part of the mission began treating with Native Americans along the way and negotiating for commercial interaction and that sort of thing. So the mission had changed in January of 1804, and really the most important aspect of that change in the mission with regard to interacting with Native Americans was becoming a very prominent aspect of the expedition at this particular point. And in fact, Lewis records, as does Clark, that they're beginning to see evidence of Sioux camps, hunting camps, and that sort of thing as they move through this area. We're also, one of the most important features of the land that we're located on right now is that we're at a place called the Big Bend, and we're going to show you a little illustration of what that is exactly, a place called the Big Bend, or the Grand Detour, as the French had recorded it. And it's actually a very, very large bend in the Missouri River, whereas Clark records it's almost 30 miles around by water, and yet it's only 1.25 miles across the landmass that causes the detour in the river. And so this is a very prominent feature on the Missouri River, and for those teachers and students who are in the audience today, we'd encourage you to take a look at your maps of the Missouri River, because while many things have changed over the last 200 years with regard to what the river looks like, the Grand Detour, or the Big Bend, is still here, and that's where we're broadcasting to you from today. As I mentioned, we are in the tribal headquarters for the Lower Brule tribe here, and it is quite a beautiful building, and we're going to show you some pictures of this building. It's a very interesting piece of architecture reflecting the traditional style of Sioux lodges here on the plains, and you'll see that while it's a very modern building in many ways, the main council chamber where we're coming to you from today is actually shaped like a teepee lodge, and so we're in that conical structure right now as we broadcast to you today. We want to tell you a little bit about what's happened to us this last week, and it's been quite an exciting week for us this past week, and we're going to start by looking at some B-roll, or some footage of what's taken place this last week. And if Jim will run that now, we'll take a look at it, and you'll see us here, and this is down near Chamberlain, South Dakota, and that's just about 40 miles below us here, something like that. And you'll see here a lot of school students there coming down to us, and that's on the southern end of the Crow Creek Reservation. There's Bud Clark, who's speaking to the history of his ancestor and doing some presentations there. Just across the river, you might have seen in that last shot, was Oklahoma, South Dakota, which is the former home of the Lower Brule Agency. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the reservations and how they have been moved repeatedly over the last 200 years. And that area there where we are here in South Dakota at Chamberlain and Oklahoma were once actually part of the early reservations for the Crow Creek and the Lower Brule Nations. Here you see Jim Stanley, one of the members of the expedition, demonstrating fire starting with flint and steel. And I'm reading from the journals here to the men, talking about the importance of, as Jefferson had communicated to the men, the importance of the meeting with the Sioux. Here we are, and if I can have Jim stop here just a moment. We are at Chamberlain. Just last week, we were visited by a group of individuals representing a grassroots movement in the Native American community, and those individuals included Alex Whiteplume, Carter Kemp, and the gentleman you see on the screen here is Russell Means. Many of you may be familiar with Russell Means, who was involved with the American Indian movement early on in the 1970s and has continued to be an activist and a voice for Native Americans. Some of you may be aware, if you're following the news, that members of a group of Lakota from Pine Ridge and some other places as well had approached our organization about stopping our expedition up the river because of the pain that it caused in people's minds, the reminder of what's happened in the last 200 years with regard to the treatment of Native American people, broken treaties on the part of the United States government, and those sorts of things. And these folks came to us and made a very passionate argument to us about what it was we were doing and the ramifications of this expedition that we are taking. And we took those comments very seriously, and we expressed to them our hope to continue to be a catalyst for conversation about issues facing Native Americans, not only historical issues, but very contemporary ones as well. And we have moved on up the river, and we continue to advocate for Native American issues as we do so. And we'll run a little bit of that footage now. This is Russell Means. Before we run this footage, Russell Means here is making a comment in this piece you're about to see, talking about the fact that while there are so many very dire issues facing Native Americans today that are of importance to all Americans, yet many of those issues are lost in the media coverage that is received on the generally speaking in the course of our daily lives. We hear very little about issues facing Native Americans. But moreover, I think for our audience, that's particularly those of our audience who live in the eastern states, it's important to understand that not only are there Native American issues that we hear very little about, we hear very little about issues facing people of this part of the country in general. I had the good fortune of being able to travel in the American West, and I can assure you that there are many issues, not the least of which are things like the forest fires that rage almost yearly in places like Washington and Oregon, Idaho, Montana. And these very devastating forest fires that destroy millions of acres of land each year, rarely do those of us who live east of the Mississippi River hear about those things. So in addition to those sorts of things, the Native American grievances, Native American concerns and issues are often lost in our mainstream media as well. And we'll let Russell Means speak to that here in this piece.
You can witness it on the daily newscast. That's if you can get through the murder and the hurricane, flood, and the fact that Madonna went over to Israel. I watched the news the other day. I couldn't believe it. That was it. The weather and Madonna went to Israel. It's amazing. That's news?
And here you see us working on the boats as we prepare to move them on up the river. And we're forced to portage the boats from Chamberlain, South Dakota, up to the Big Bend Dam. There was enough water in the river for us to move the boats up to the Big Bend Dam, but because of some issues related to management of the Missouri River, the water was so low at the dam that we couldn't actually take the boats out on the boat ramps there, so we were forced to bring the boats up above the dam by truck. And here you see of course, we've been very fortunate to have National Guard trucks help us move the boats around the dams. And here we are coming into the Crow Creek Reservation, North Bend Recreation Area at Fort Thompson. There's Gary Ulrich in the water helping to act as a guide for the boats as they come in. We were very fortunate to spend time with the children of the Crow Creek Reservation, as well as yesterday and today spending time here in Lower Brule with school kids, telling them about not only this time in history, but just very specifically about some of the equipment and the life that the men who were on the expedition led as they made their way across the country as well. And here we are meeting with Chairman Dwayne Big Eagle from the Crow Creek Reservation just across the river from us. And Mr. Big Eagle was very hospitable, and we appreciate the hospitality and friendliness that was extended to us there, and the opportunity to spend time in that community. And here's Bud Clark presenting Chairman Big Eagle with a replica peace medal, as we have done with the chairmen of the First Nations as we've moved across the country. And Dwayne and his wife Diane received us with open arms, and we certainly appreciate their kind words and hospitality as we were there in their community. And as I mentioned before, here we are at the Great Bend, at the Big Bend of the Missouri River, and you can see there what an unusual spot that is. And if I can have Jim hold that for just a moment, you'll see that neck there that narrows where the river goes around. We've talked extensively over the last months about the change in the Missouri River. We've talked about oxbows that have been cut off. One of the things that makes this such a unique place is the fact that the land that we're located on, where the tribal headquarters are that we're broadcasting from today, are located almost exactly where that X is shown on your screen. And one of the interesting things is that that neck of land there is an extremely high elevation. We're several hundred feet probably right now above the elevation of the river. And one of the things that's defining about this place is that unlike many of those other oxbows, this one will quite likely never be cut off because of the landmass that extends along that neck. It's a high ridge line of hills here, and it's quite unlikely that at least for probably many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years yet, that this piece of land will extend out into the Missouri River, and the Missouri River will be forced to go around it. And it's one of those great things as we study the earth that we all live on. We have this understanding of how powerful the river is, and yet in a place like this, the river itself must bend to accommodate the earth itself as it moves around this prominent landmass. So once again, here we are. We are here, as the sign says there on the slide that you see before you. And here's some more footage of where we are today, high above the river. And here we are. This image is outside of the Tribal Council building with very spectacular artwork with the 4 lodges that are sitting outside. Indicative of the traditional lodge of the Sioux nations. And here you see the architecture that I was speaking to before. That's the council chamber, and we're inside that teepee-like structure that you see there against the building as we come to you today. And this is some footage from inside the council building, which is really quite a remarkable space, both for its architecture and the artwork which is displayed inside of it, reflecting many important scenes from Lakota tradition here at Lower Brule. That's another important distinction. When we came to you from Marty, South Dakota, just a couple of weeks ago, we were with the Dakota. We're in the land of Dakota, and on the other side of the river here at Crow Creek, that is also Dakota. And today we're in the land of the Lakota people, and those language derivations we've talked about, the L, D, and the N of the Siouan linguistic Siouan language. So we're going to tell you today, as we told you from Marty, and as we would say in Crow Creek, we would say Pidama for joining us today. But today, since we're on the other side of the river, we're going to say Pilama, and I'd like to say Pilamalo to Chairman Mike Genro for joining us today. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this broadcast.
Well, one of the things we want to talk about today is the traditional culture of the Lakota people and the Lower Brule tribe specifically. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the tribe?
The tribe is called the Kuichashoyate, which is the Lowman Nation. Our particular band of the Brule have always existed along the Missouri River, and our hunting area ran roughly from the Niobrara River to the south, to the Cheyenne River to the north, to the Black Hills. Our particular band was literally split in 1889. In 1865, there was a treaty passed which gave us a portion of land, or identified for our use a portion of land south of here. It was from the mouth of the White River to a place on the south end of this reservation called Fort Lookout, where a fort had been established, and 10 miles in depth, and to the east bank of the Missouri River. In 1889, because the government could not move alcohol or munitions across Indian country, and because the railhead had situated themselves at Chamberlain, South Dakota, and could not pass through Indian country without condemning it, our reservation was literally totally moved for the advancement of America, or the economics of America. and for the process of keeping the government itself criminal free. And when it did that, our tribe split. A portion of our tribe remained south of the White River on Sichangu or Rosebud land, and the remainder of our tribe moved to this particular site. Probably the greatest devastation that occurred is that our land then began to be opened up for homestead. A portion of our land, under the guise that those members who remained south of the White River were going to be allotted land on the Rosebud territory, nearly half of our reservation on the west end was taken by agreement with the male membership of our tribe that remained here. However, all of these activities did not occur, and the tribe found itself developing on a smaller and smaller land base. In 1934, there was a act of Congress passed that was called the Indian Reorganization Act, and under that act, it allowed for the reacquisition of lands within the exterior boundary of the reservation. And so our leadership at that time started that process. We have followed that process for a great length of time and have reacquired a lot of our land base. But the whole history of the tribe has been an intense struggle and a real test of the endurance and the adaptability of our tribal membership. As I've said in talks before, I believe that the Lower Brule people are probably the most adaptable while still hanging on to the ideals of traditional culture of any band of the Sioux Nation. That their ability to overlook so many of the atrocities that have occurred as a result of the intrusion of Lewis and Clark, who were just forerunners of many of the actions that occurred later in the land dispossession and everything else. You know, many people can say, well, it was the French fur traders that started the process. Well, the French fur traders were too interested in creating a family life, and many intermarried, and many of the people that you see on the respective reservations as you go through are a result of their interaction. They were not so much oriented about the possession of land and utilization of land and the exclusion of tribal members from such land. So this whole process, while very important to the American government, was done at a very, very high expense to our people.
Thank you for those insightful words. I'd like to go back just a little bit and talk about the moment that Lewis and Clark came here in 1804. First of all, they knew when they came here, they already were familiar with the term Lower Brule or Brule. Can you tell us a little bit about where that name comes from?
Well, from my understanding, that brûlé is a French word that means burnt, and it comes from many different stories about our people being in a engagement with another tribe, and the fire was started, and as our people ran through the fire, their legs were burnt, and thereby created the ideal that we became known as the people with the burned legs.
And that was a name that the French had given to the tribe.
Yeah, and that's thereby, because Sichangu means the burnt thighs or the burnt legs.
Well, thank you for that, because that was something that people had been asking about, is where that name came from. When Lewis and Clark came here themselves, do you have any thoughts about that initial interaction? I mean, separated from what did happen subsequent to that, the initial interaction. And the reason I bring this up is that over the last week or so, there was a conference here, a symposium here last week, and a number of speakers who were here in the area. And one of the things that, and you mentioned the interaction of the French when they were here. This particular group of men that comprised the core of Discovery 200 years ago, when they came through this area, there is speculation that there was many personal relationships between members of the expedition and members of the tribe, not the least of which was perhaps even a relationship between Meriwether Lewis and a young woman from the Lower Brule tribe. And there are members of the Lower Brule tribe who actually, and certainly as I understand it, the oral tradition of the tribe is that Meriwether Lewis may have had some children or a child here on this reservation, or it wasn't a reservation, of course, but here among the Lower Brule.
Well, actually, that relationship was with I believe, if history is right, and if the oral history of one of the descendants is right, that lady was actually from the Two Kettles band up north of here. But because of the relationship between the Two Kettles and the Lower Brules, there was a very close association. In fact, our treaty of 1865 talks about the Lower Brules requesting that the Two Kettles be placed on a reservation immediately adjacent to the Lower Brules, so that their ongoing relationship could continue. Nevertheless, John Lewis became a member of our tribe. He married a lady from the Rencounter family, and he purportedly is the son of Meriwether Lewis, and that family lives, a part of the family lives here on the reservation, a part of the family lives in Rapid City and in different other parts of the country, but they are enrolled members of our tribe. The engagement between the Lower Brules and Lewis and Clark initially was, from the best of my understanding, was one of adversity, that there was a great concern, and whether that concern was perpetuated by the gossip of the Frenchmen or who it was perpetuated by, there was a great concern about what this intrusion would mean, and so members of the Lower Brule band attempted to dissuade Lewis and Clark from further going up the river. However, they came to some kinds of understanding, and nevertheless, Lewis and Clark proceeded on up the river. And as the story goes, they ran into a band of the Ogallala above where they had met with the Lower Brules, and they told them on us. They told them that we had, that our particular band had not been very courteous or willing to interact with Lewis and Clark. So goes the story.
Do you think that obviously in the ensuing 200 years, And I think history speaks for itself with regard to what has happened to not only the Lower Brule tribe, but to the Sioux Nation as a whole, and to other Native American tribes. This bicentennial of this expedition 200 years ago, is there, and this was discussed at length at the symposium the other day, and is there a hope that the awareness that the bicentennial is bringing to Native issues, is there a hope that some good will come out of the awareness that's being made? As we spoke earlier, people who live back east, not only are they unaware of Native American issues, but they're largely ignorant of issues concerning all people who live in this region of the country, because there's very little news that we get back east oftentimes about just everyday issues, let alone these very significant issues with regard to treaties and issues that are facing Native Americans in their homeland today. Is there a hope that despite the pain certainly associated with remembering this moment in history, that there is also some hopefulness about what the awareness may mean?
As I stated earlier, the adaptability of our people is probably one of the most significant things that I watch constantly, and see that while there's great adaptability, there's also a real desire to cling to those things that are important in reminding each and every one of us who are members of this tribe and members of other tribes of our own Indianness and our responsibility to that Indianness. As far as the educational process, I think probably it's the greatest opportunity that has been afforded our tribes by interacting with this particular activity to really begin an educational process and to really elicit the support that can be garnered through transmissions such as this, allowing people across the nation to really understand that we are not the burden to those who are ultra-conservative, who feel that we should be cut off from those obligations that America owes to American Indians, but and to those liberals, if they are willing to help us to do what we can ourselves. In other words, that the self-sufficiency that we must garner to truly succeed and to truly exist in our culture, with our traditions, we must be allowed to do, and they must not be used as playthings or idealisms that just anyone can come and pick up and carry on. Being an Indian means so much, but it means, first of all, truly accepting yourself totally for who you are. The governmental system, the parochial systems utilized by religious have really done a lot to create an identity crisis for many of our people. A typical example, and it's one that is painful to me, yet it's very true. Last night I was discussing some of the issues surrounding this activity with some of the members of your contingent, and we were having a very good conversation. And a young lady walked by who's a member of our tribe, and I believe in democracy, and I believe everyone has the right to state their own opinion. but chose at that time, as she passed beyond us, to level some very disparaging remarks about myself. And one of the crew members from your looked at me and said, "Gee, do you have to put up with that all the time?" And I said, "Not really." And we talked about the need to really have people, if you know yourself and you're able to really accept yourself in the status that you are as an Indian person, the respect level that you reflect to others is indicated by it. And some of the processes that have been identified as acceptable by the Anglo society allows that denegating or destroying anyone is a constitutional right. I don't believe it's a constitutional right. I think it's just a lot of disrespect. But that is, one of the areas that has happened as a result of governmental intrusion, of religious intrusion, of ideals of real false democracy. Democracy is one of the most beautiful things as long as it's done with respect for oneself and for the society and for the culture and for the environment in which you exist.
You talked about some of the things that are facing, aside from issues of identity crisis because of all of the layers of influence, whether they be governmental or religion and that sort of things. What are some of the things, and I want to mention before I ask you this question, one of the things, we were here 3 years ago and had the opportunity to share some time here at Lower Brule 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned to some of the folks here in the audience today that sometimes an outside view is a good one because you can see change more drastically than if you're in that environment all of the time. And we have noticed, those of us who were here 3 years ago, what we see as a upswing and a vital, and I don't know, maybe we didn't have a good view last time either, but certainly this visit to Lower Brule this time, we have seen what we believe to be growth and a lot of real positive things happening here in this community. And with that in mind, and having said that, what are some of the things, the real workaday things that you're faced with as the chairman of this tribe, both good and bad, things that are happening in the right way and things that are still some of the most devastating or most challenging issues that you have to deal with as tribal chairman here today?
Probably some of the most difficult parts of the process is really creating viable, stable employment for the members of our tribe. It's a very difficult process. Difficult because in all aspects that occur, the easiest solution for many people is to bring industry into our reservation. But it's an industry usually that is at the tail end of being a real development that has any longevity. It's usually a fading market. It's not a new market, it's not a growing market, it's not a developing market. We've talked about call centers. Everybody and his half-brother have a call center. We've talked about so many things that are out there today that are those opportunities are quickly going to third world countries where they can get it done even cheaper than we could do it. And so it's difficult to access so many of the markets where real job development or sales processes are available to us. So the only opportunity that we have left is to take our own resources and to try and develop what is a continuing resource and market that in a way that helps us. So what do we have? We have agriculture primarily. We have a renewing crops. We have animals. We have different opportunities here with the development of ethanol, with the development of feedlots, with the development of those kinds of things that are most generic to our reservation. And so we have to concentrate on those, and it takes a lot of money to do that. We have the potential to do some wind development. We are in the process right now of doing a study, or an expanded study, to try and train some folks to work in that industry if they so choose, and so that will be some sustainable jobs. We are, on the other hand, we will soon have 28 permanent jobs here. How many our people will be able to qualify for or will be desirable of qualifying for is another thing, because it's and again another negative process. It has to do with a regional detention facility. You know, all about violence, all about division. However, we hope to make this detention center a rehab center where that people who are in a position to be incarcerated can be helped to redevelop their life and to further their education. That is one opportunity. We've taken this last fall and we put some money together out of our own tribal resources to clean up our community, to get ready for, for the winter, for activities that were occurring or can occur here on the reservation. And our folks did a tremendous job. There was a great outpouring and a real desire to make their value really known by how they performed. They performed at a very significantly high level. They were very faithful to their jobs. They showed up on time for the most part. They got the tasks done. Now we need to take that enthusiasm and move it to the next step of taking and develop something even more viable, possibly in a tourism industry, possibly in assisting them in accessing opportunity as guides, utilizing their own artistic talents to sell product to the incoming public, but that will only last so long too. We have to collectively, not just our tribal government, but we have to collectively as a people determine where do we want to go, how do we want to get there, how responsible are we going to hold one another to accomplishing a life here on the reservation that will allow for growth and development of all of our folks. We try to do all of our construction here, and in some cases we find ourselves in a situation where folks are not able to be hired in large part, maybe because of drugs and alcohol. Those are problems on our reservation. We have to find a way to deal with them more significantly than we are now. But the real success of where we will go is how supportive individual families are of one another. How we take the responsibility to one another as relatives, as extended family members, and really identify and deal with that. We cannot, as a governing body, legislate love. We cannot legislate concern. Those have to generate back out of the old cultural idealism of the responsibility of extended families for one another.
You mentioned, and I would just like to make a side note here, you mentioned tourism. And I can tell you, for those of our viewing audience who have not had the opportunity to be here, every time I come across the Big Bend Dam, and I've been fortunate enough to do this many times over the last few years, and I make that right-hand turn on 5 down here, the road coming in to Lower Brule, this is truly one of the most beautiful places, and all along the river, from its mouth, where I live, down by the Mississippi River, to its headwaters. And sometimes we take things for granted, but certainly the folks here should know how blessed they are to live in a place like this. The beauty of the landscape here is just absolutely overwhelming, and I would encourage anyone who has the opportunity to travel through this part of the country to visit this land and see the magnificence of it. This morning I was coming here to the tribal headquarters, and there were a herd of elk grazing just below here, and the other day there were buffalo on your grazing lands that you have here below the tribal headquarters, and just the spectacular beauty of this area. And so from a tourism perspective, I think that there's certainly a market for that, because I think that all people from the world over should have an opportunity to understand why Native people are so protective stewards of this land, because it is such a spectacular and beautiful place, and we're certainly privileged and honored to have the opportunity to be here with you all today. I wanted to ask you about something else that's really been in our hearts since we've been here, and again, something that we became aware of 3 years ago, and it was an eye-opening experience as we traveled through this area. But can we talk for just a minute about South Dakota as an entity aside from the rest of the country? Racism in South Dakota. It has been something that has just absolutely slapped us in the face here. We were shocked by what we saw. And would you speak to that issue here in South Dakota a little bit, please?
Tragically, racism in South Dakota is here. It is so ingrained, and it is so much a part of the existence that many people don't even recognize that it exists. Economic opportunity is here on the reservation and off the reservation is for an Indian person is always greatly diminished by the whole sense of racism. Economically, the dollars that we generate are gladly accepted by those folks off the reservation, but the treatment and the interaction back on a whole is very, very bad. There are individuals who are very good people who a lot of our members get along with and interact with, but on the broad base, racism is just an accepted part of the existence of non-Indians with Indians. If you go into a store in any community and your skin is brown, or they know that you're an Indian, that the way you're treated, the way you're looked at, is different. If you go into a bank to borrow money and you come from the reservation and you're an Indian, unless you have a substantial bank account, a substantial set of assets, your ability to access service is very difficult, in spite of all the laws that have passed, Community Reinvestment Act, all of those types of things that dictate that there must be due consideration. It's very difficult for an Indian with a good job to walk into a bank and say, I would like to borrow $100 just until payday. The bank's immediate attitude, even here on the reservation, is, boy, we don't really make enough money on that $100 loan to really make it worthwhile. Even though you have the employment, you have the ability to pay that back your next payday. As the chairman of the tribe, there's been so many individuals that have come to me and asked, can you co-sign? And to co-sign for $100 note is so ridiculous, you know. And even at that, but I guess each and every one of these young people probably have their own experience with racism, and each would have a story to tell you as to their individual interactions, whether it's through sports that they've been involved with, or school trips that they've went on, but how do you change the heart of a group of people unless they choose to change it themselves?
Well, I want to thank you again for taking some time out of your schedule to join us today. And we have no email. What I'd like to do, though, before we do leave, is there anyone here in our audience today that has a question for either myself or the chairman today? Is there anyone here who has a question or a comment that they would like to make? We have an opportunity and a forum here for you to speak, and we'd certainly like to extend that to you at this point.
I'm very glad that you showed
Could-
up here.
could you-
It's very important for all of us here.
We're gonna bring a microphone over here.
It's very important that you all showed up here to let everybody see you here, and it's important to the people that are here because they have, like you said, they have a chance to speak up to you and to Mike, and that's very, very neat and very generous that you all showed up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you saying that. I would just like to say that in the opportunities that we've had to travel through South Dakota, and all of these things that have been spoken to today by Chairman Janro, the one thing I'd like to say to you, Mr. Chairman, is that I've spoken with a lot of members of your tribe, and despite what one young lady may have said last night, I know that there are a lot of people who are here who are appreciative and thankful for the leadership that you have provided to this tribe. And there's no question in my mind that if the Lower Brule people have a brighter future tomorrow with your leadership, and certainly like to let you know how much we appreciate the opportunity that you've given us to spend time here among your people. And you know, the hospitality that we have received here was absolutely tremendous, and we want you to know that when we go back into the world back east of the Mississippi River, and we tell our story not just through the internet but at a very personal level, that the concerns and issues facing your tribe and Native Americans as a whole will be something that we carry in our heart and in our words. And once again, I'd like to just say, Pilalolo, thank you very much for being here. And until we see you next time, we'll proceed on. And as they might say here at Lower Brule, Loshake.